There is a day in all of our work lives when it will all be over. It's not like we get to 50 and we're nearly in the grave. Oh no, women are quite likely now to live into their 90s, even beyond, till we're 100. But actually, women over 50 make up a quarter of the population. There are lots of different ways of being a Queenager. I mean, my real definition of it is being a Queenager is whatever you want it to be.
Hi, I'm Cary, and welcome to the Eat Nourish Love Podcast. For over 20 years, I've created events, raised over 4 million for good causes, and been lucky enough to meet some incredible people along the way. This podcast is about exploring stories and insights that really shape us, with inspiring guests from wellness, business, self-care, and personal growth. It's about learning to trust our intuition and discovering what truly matters, and how, with hard work, belief, and tenacity, we can make so many things happen. Oh, I've been waiting for a long time to have Eleanor on our podcast, the Eat Nourish Love Podcast. And hi, Eleanor. Nice to see you today. So you're a campaigner, a best-selling author, an award-winning journalist, and you've got this most amazing book that's become in 2024 was a Times bestseller. Yeah, that one. But geez, there's so much behind it. You held senior roles at the Sunday Times for 23 years, including editorial director and editor of the Sunday Times magazine. And oh my goodness, what a journey. So just let's start. Where did this all start for you?
I suppose my latest incarnation began with what felt like a total disaster, which I write about in my book. But all of us who work for a company know that at some point, it's a bit like the David Nichols book, One Day, that there is a day in all of our work lives when it will all be over, when we'll get summoned in by HR and the box of tissues will be on the table and you're basically told that your services are no longer required. I stuck it out for a pretty long time. I was there for 23 years before that happened to me. And I think, like for most people, it comes as a real shock. And I had based so much of my identity and so much of my life had been around being this kind of senior journalist. I write about it as feeling like I was wearing a kind of Game of Thrones cloak with all the kind of, the gold insignia and the fur and all that kind of stuff. So you have this kind of big status. And then suddenly when you lose that job, all that goes, everything that you kind of thought your life was about is suddenly kind of ripped out from underneath you. And what I now know is that happens to so many women at this time. I'm kind of going to get ahead, but we did some research which shows that over half of women, by the time they hit 50, have been through at least 5 of what we call the Queenager horses of the apocalypse, and midlife apocalypse, which are divorce, bereavement, redundancy, caring for elderly parents and kind of watching them die, dealing with or coping with a Gen Z child with anxiety or some kind of, chronic self-harm or those kind of things. There's so much of that around. Not to mention a bit of our own health issues, some menopause, other kinds of domestic, financial, mental abuse. So if you kind of factor all of those things, over half of women have been through 5 of those. And what we see is that they often all come together in what I call a midlife collision. And they really derail whatever it was that we were doing before. So for me, the kind of big kind of horse of the midlife apocalypse was this redundancy, which left me kind of without this cloak, a bit like Darth Vader when he takes off his cloak. And it's like, well, who are you underneath? You're this kind of funny kind of amoeba. And you kind of come blinking out into the outside world and you go, well, who am I now without this thing that has defined me, whether that's a marriage or, if we think about kind of empty nesting or really whatever it is that we've been doing between the ages of 25 and 50, we see kind of comes to a close. But there isn't really a conversation, I don't think, in our culture about what happens then? Because, of course, it's not like we get to 50 and we're nearly in the grave. Oh, no. Women are quite likely now to live into their 90s, even beyond, till we're 100. And so I called my new company, which I set up when I left the Sunday Times, Noon, as in the middle of the day, because in the 100-year life, 50 is only halfway through. It's lunchtime. we've got the whole of the afternoon and the evening to come. And I think that reframing is incredibly important, because when I suddenly found myself kind of, beached, having to reinvent, having to have a whole new life at 50, there was just nothing around in the culture that showed a path for how we might do that, or what that might look like. And so that was really what I was trying to set up when I set up Noon and I started writing about this midlife pivot, that there wasn't really anything out there. I can remember Googling redundancy at 50 and getting the HMRC website, which was not really the kind of inspirational content or the kind of stepping stones to a new life that I was looking for. So because I've been a journalist for such a long time, and I was a columnist for, 10 years more on the Sunday Times, I kind of knew that things that were happening to me were likely to be happening to other people too. So I think that gave me the confidence to start talking about it and to start writing about it. And of course, being made redundant is very shameful in our culture. People don't talk about it. I first wrote about it in the Telegraph, and they put a headline on it going 50 and on the scrap heap, which was not very pleasant. But that was, and I got so many people get in touch with me, like thousands of people got in touch with me saying, thank you for writing this piece about how horrid it is to be made redundant. It happened to me. I felt so shameful about it. Nobody talks about it. And in a way, it is a bit like bereavement, because nobody knows what to say. And I think that there is this kind of big kind of silence about what happens to people who've been quite successful for kind of, several decades. And it's men too. And you suddenly get to this point in midlife where all that experience, all that success seems to count for nothing, and you've got to start again. And yet in our culture, there isn't that conversation, but there should be, because at 50, we're not going to get our pension till we're 68. So that's like nearly another 20 years. By the time I get there, I'm 54 now. It's probably going to be more like 75, I reckon. And given what's happening with Trump and the stock market at the moment, none of us are ever going to retire. So we have to work out how we're going to live, what we're going to do, what comes next. And so I'm all about trying to create a new map, some new signposts, a new vision for what particularly women's lives might look like after 50. And I think that we really need some new stories and some new kind of models and some new icons and inspiration here, because in our culture, the only story that we really have about older women is that they're grandmothers. And actually, about nearly 30% of university educated women of Generation X are not mothers. So if you haven't been a mother, you're not going to be a grandmother. No. And therefore, we really need some new stories. So if you're a child-free woman, there's hardly any kind of message for what the rest of your life is going to look like. And that's nearly a third of our generation. So that is a really huge amount of disenfranchised women. And also, as a newspaper editor, I knew how difficult it was to get stories about older women, the women I call Queenagers, because I thought we needed a bit of a rebrand. And it was very hard to get stories about older women in the paper. I think that there's a huge pressure on us as we age to kind of try and remain youthful, to kind of keep some kind of currency. I was speaking to a very senior American media executive yesterday, and she was saying that the pressure on women, particularly in America, to not get old because there's a kind of total, ceiling on their careers, I can see you nodding, is really intense. And then that plays into this kind of beauty arms race, and you end up with Martha Stewart on the cover of Sports Illustrated in a bikini at 84. And I don't think that is a positive way of thinking about what women are for as we age. It's not about hanging on to the currency we had when we were younger. For me, it's about how do we put back at the heart of the culture the wisdom of older women, the experience, our wiseness, our intuition, the life lessons that we have to offer those coming up behind us. And that sense of the wise woman has really gone from our culture. And that's a very white Western phenomenon. It's interesting. If I talk to my friends who are Black or Asian, or I spend quite a lot of time in Jamaica, and they have a very different idea about older women. Older women there still have kind of much more power, agency, respect, whereas we've lost that here in the West because women are seen through this kind of very patriarchal lens, what I call the male lens, which really values us for being, young, fecund, kind of fertile, fanciable, kind of all the Fs, and hasn't really thought about what we're for. But actually, women over 50 make up a quarter of the population. And we also control a huge amount of the money. We're behind over 90% of all household consumer spending decisions. And yet we appear in between about 6 to 10% of adverts. And that's usually a kind of woman walking down the beach with her silver fox husband, or on a cruise, or it's for insurance, or it's a stand a stair lift or an incontinence pad. It's not really representing women, as we are. And I think that that's a real problem. And I think it's a problem in the wider media too. So it's why I set up Noon to try and wrote this book, much more to come, to say we can tell different stories about what women are for as they age. And actually, it's incredibly important that we do.
Oh my goodness. What I love is what you're doing here is massive, really, because so much of the conversation recently has been about the menopause and women in the menopause. And actually, as a woman over 50, I don't want to just be associated with the menopause. It's so much bigger than that. You talk about effect. And I always think about, actually, I've got children, got 2 boys and a girl. So it's difficult for men too. I think, as you say, a lot of them go through redundancy. But also, I want to be an example for my daughter to show that actually there's this life to live afterwards, and it's exciting. And you need to have the confidence to find yourself.
No, I think that that's really important, and I think you notice I mentioned menopause as kind of part of the kind of midlife apocalypse kind of horses, but it's not, for me. It's not the framing lens, and I think that that's the really important thing. Is that it's a bit like seeing kind of all women through a kind of pregnancy lens, or I wouldn't look at my teenage daughters and go, "Oh, you're menstrual." They go, "What, mum? What are you?" I mean, they do quite a lot of eye roll, "What, mum?" anyway. But if I started going, "Oh, darling, you're menstrual," they'd look at me like they really wanted to kill me. And I feel a bit the same way about being viewed through a menopausal lens. It's why I talk about queenagers not walking hot flushes. I don't want to be put in a hot, sweaty menopause box. I think it's incredibly important that we have a conversation about menopause, and it's not a taboo, and doctors know what they're talking about, which was not the case before amazing people like Davina and whatever, and doctors and people like Dr. Nigat or Kate Muir has written a brilliant book. But it's really important that the taboo around menopause is busted. But we don't want to be just seen through a kind of hysterical hormonal lens. I think that's actually incredibly misogynistic. And for me, it harks back to the worst of kind of Victorian times, where women were seen as hysterical. I mean, the word hysterical comes from the word for womb in Greek. And women in Victorian times were seen as having the kind of mental competency of children or dogs because of their wombs. So there's a very kind of ancient, misogynistic, undermining characteristic to seeing women through their biological functions. And for me, the whole point of feminism was for women to escape their biology, to not be entirely defined by what our wombs were doing or what we were choosing to do with them, but who we were. We have so many other qualities. And I think that women seen through the male lens are basically being seen in black and white, only for being kind of, fecund or fanciable, rather than being seen as the rainbow of qualities which we are. So our creativity, our experience, our intelligence, our dynamism, or our Cary, all the things that women are, get kind of brushed out. They get kind of bleached out into the kind of black and white of what we really appear to be for men. And so I'm really calling for women, particularly older women, to be seen in full technicolor, because if otherwise we don't value them for all their qualities. And therefore putting us in this hot pink menopause box, I think, although to begin with it seemed quite empowering, it's not who we are. You're completely right. And it's in danger, I think, of really fueling gendered ageism within our culture in a way that's not helpful.
I think it's always quite interesting because when you unpack something like this, just like, the now supporting female founders and how few of them are funded. And so there's a huge movement going on in the younger generation with the female founders and supporting each other. And I think one of the things I love that you've talked about is the sisterhood. It's supporting women supporting.
Yeah.
And I think that with your work being in a very male dominated society, you went to Oxford, didn't you, and with the newspapers, actually, there was this competition between women, which we should let go now. We just need to bring each other together.
Yeah, and that's certainly what I see within my Noon community. So, out the book, it's a kind of slightly complicated, it's a tangled web. So, I when I left the Sunday Times, I set up Noon, and Noon is a platform and a community of women in midlife, home of the Queenager, I call it, and we run as part of that what we call Noon circles, where the women come and we run these supportive groups where everyone talks about what's going on for them. And what's wonderful about that is that it creates this map. So I was sitting in one last week where one woman turned up, she was very upset, saying she thought that her marriage really wasn't working and it was going to have to end. And then like two along the circle was another woman who was going, oh, I was exactly where you were 18 months ago. And I left my husband. And then two along from her was another woman was going, yeah, I got divorced 5 years ago and it felt like the end of the world. But now I'm much happier. I've got a new partner. I'm doing this. I'm living in a new place. And a bit like most of it, that what you felt like was the end, was the worst thing, it's actually turned out to be, a bit of a blessing in disguise. And I think we see that quite a lot. So I'm interested in the nature of transition, how we support each other as women through this transition and create this new map, and what the tools are that we need in order to be able to do that. Because interestingly, we also find in our research, it's not all gloom and doom. We find that the women who have been through the most, who shed the most in their 50s, whatever, 60s, end up the happiest, because they end up with a life that they've chosen, which is resonant for them. They're not kind of in the kind of wreckage of the life that was right for them between 25 and 50 and now feels a bit uncomfortable or a bit scratchy or isn't now what they need. So I think it's also about us being kind of brave enough maybe sometimes to admit that things aren't working. And what's interesting about the women who come to Noon is some of them come, a bit like I kind of got to that point because I felt like I'd been pushed off a roof. I didn't have a choice. But and that may be because of divorce or death or, redundancy, whatever it is, empty nest, all those things. But then there's another cohort who come, and I think they're really brave because they feel stuck, that they feel like one of them said to me the other day, she said, I feel like I haven't chosen any of it. I look around at my life and I think, how did I end up here? This isn't me. I haven't chosen any of it. Or another woman described it to me as feeling like she was sleepwalking through her own life. And I think that there is something about hitting this point, this kind of midlife point, where we probably realise we've got less time under the bridge, we've got more time under the bridge than we've got ahead of us.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's that Mary Oliver thing. What are you going to do with your one wild and precious life? Is that enough for you? What did you start out really wanting to do? What were your kind of own dreams? And I think so many women have got so caught up in caring for other people, working really hard, kind of life's been kind of coming at them so fast that it's been a long time since they've actually taken a pause and gone, crikey, who am I? What do I want, Eleanor? Not, what my parents wanted for me or what I need to do for my kids or for my husband or for my job. Who am I? And what do I care about? And what does it mean to me to be here? And what do I need to do to feel like this life that I've lived has been lived to the kind of fullness of everything it can be? I'm a great believer in that Jungian idea of individuation, that we're all here to be the kind of, acme, the ultimate expression of who we are and who we might be.
It's almost like there's this wheel, we get on this wheel and it goes round and suddenly, that our lives either have children or we get married or we don't get married and then we work and it all just, and we just go from day to day and suddenly...
So what happened?
and you're right. The people who actually say are honest and say I'm stuck is probably the hardest. Can I just go back? So you walked into the room after how many years? 23 years.
Yeah, 23 years. And I was, I was a big grand fromage. I was the editorial director. I was running the magazine. I was won loads of prizes. I thought it was all going fine. And then suddenly I was out. And that is as anyone knows, it's a bit like being in a car crash when something happens to that. Like if somebody, someone close to you dies, or there's a time before and there's a time afterwards, and you can't go back. And I think for a long time, my brain just kept going back to that moment of sitting in that office watching the pigeons flying around Southwark Cathedral and the kind of tugboats chugging up the Thames. And it's like you've completely dissociated. People are kind of passing papers around and telling you important things, but your brain just can't take it in. Like when you have a bike accident or a car crash and everything suddenly goes into very slow motion. And I think it's really important that we talk about how you rebuild yourself after that, because I see so many women who are, very stuck or very frightened, or something like that's happened to them and they don't know how to reinvent or how they might even start. And I certainly think that the beginning of that is really kind of sitting in the dark a bit and feeling your pain. I don't think you can, people I see who just try and kind of immediately bounce back and throw themselves into something else. It doesn't work. You have to feel the loss.
I think in your book as well, and I think that I've had a situation, just walked in and bang, and I'd given 19 years to something, and it was like sat on in London and cried my eyes out and phoned my husband and said, did this really just happen? And actually it is the shock. And I realized the two things was that you have to lean into it. You can't go up around it, up it. You have to go through.
Yeah, there's that wonderful bit from that children's book, We're Going on a Bear Hunt, which I quote in my book, which is like, you can't go over it, can't go under it, got to go through it. You can't dodge that step. I was talking to a good friend recently who's in that phase, and she was going, I'm just going to apply for some jobs and, I'll just get back into it, whatever. You can't do that. You have to sit and absorb what's happened to you and really take on board that there isn't a going back, that you're in a new phase now. And I think it's very important to take a pause and really work out what you're going to do next. And I think that that's actually an opportunity. I've got a lovely friend called Claire Dubois, and she said to me, she'd set up something called Tree Sisters, and then she'd stepped away from that, and she just said it's very important to be putty for a while. I really like that phrase, which is to kind of not know, to be okay, to sit in the uncertainty, to be okay with not knowing what's going to come next. And I took that very seriously. So I did a lot of trying all sorts of wacky things. I went off to Jamaica and took magic mushrooms. I've done a lot of silent retreats, yoga and meditation. I've done quite a lot of constellations. I've done forest bathing, ice baths, Wim Hof, all sorts of different things to try and get in touch with where I wanted to go next. I had quite a lot of childhood baggage to shift. And I think that a lot of us do at 50, that we think, or in midlife, that we think that we've kind of put out those childhood demons to rest. But actually what happens at midlife is, our parents start getting ill, one's thrust back into the kind of bosom of that birth family. And you realise that there is so much unresolved stuff, or there certainly was for me, and I see it a lot in the women in the circle. So that's like in this 25 to 50, we've been ticking all these boxes that we kind of thought that society told us we needed in order to be happy, or what success looked like for us or for our family or for our culture. And I think that there's this opportunity at 50, when lots of that falls away, to finally ask ourselves the question, well, what do I want? What does that mean for me? It's all very well living everyone else's dreams, but what are my own dreams? And I think it can take us a long time to get to that point. And for a lot of women, we're so busy keeping the balls in the air that we kind of never stop and actually ask ourselves those questions and kind of think, well, hang on, who am I doing this for? So that's what I've been doing when I've been doing a lot of this kind of, stuff which looks a bit more wacky, because I think that there is a sense that we need to move into a deeper sense of ourselves and becoming more comfortable with spending some real time with ourselves. I've just come back from 6 days of silent retreat.
Wow.
In Devon, and lots of people are horrified by the idea of that. And you hand in your phone, you don't read books, you can't listen to any podcasts, no radio, so it's just you and your thoughts, and your body. There's a lot of meditation and yoga and a lot of swimming in the river and that kind of thing. So but that silence and the opportunity to to actually lie for half an hour under a cherry tree and look at the blossom, or kind of sit and look at the river and just kind of be with yourself. I think in our culture, we just don't really do that enough. And for me, there's been very much a kind of spiritual aspect to this midlife moment.
So a couple of things there. I think that's really interesting because actually I think we're often frightened of being with ourselves. And I know that you mentioned in your book that one of the hardest things you found was the spirituality area of your life.
Mm. Or venturing into that. I mean, I come from a background. My father is a hardcore atheist. It's probably like the worst thing you could say to him is that you have any kind of spiritual belief or you believe in a kind of higher power. I'd be absolutely horrified by that. But I think it's also, I think for women, there's something, and I was trained in a very, I went to Westminster. I had a very privileged upbringing. So I went to Westminster School, very boys' school. I went to Oxford. I then worked for the Sunday Times. So I've been very much in that kind of male world where, they're really only interested in you from the kind of neck up. So they're kind of, it's all about the brain and the kind of what can, your capacity to logic and argue kind of, logically and, be clever about what you know. And so I think I lived so much in my head. I felt like I was kind of carrying my head around on a stick, that I wasn't really in my body. And I think that that's something that we women really need to be, that sense of kind of intuition and an embodied wisdom. And I now know that my mind is in service, to my heart and my bigger sense of in myself of what's right. And I can feel it. I feel like my whole body's become like a kind of antennae. If I'm having a conversation with someone where there's a real sense of truth or something important being said, I can feel it in my body. I get kind of tingles, what my friend Leslie calls the feels. And I think a lot of women do, but we've been so taught to, and men, but we've been so taught to bypass that. And actually, if we only live from our heads, we're missing so much of the richness of our experience and of what we can bring and of leading in a different kind of a way, in a more kind of, heart-centric way. So when I sit in the circle and I speak to the women and I hear their stories, I think partly because my book is very vulnerable and I've been very open about how awful that felt, the women feel that they can come and also be really honest about what's really going on. And often they come and they step into the noon circle and they say, this is the first time I've ever spoken this out loud. So it's a safe space for reinvention, reconnection, vulnerability, finding support, finding the sense of what your next steps might be, and taking inspiration from the other women, the other kind of 25, 30 women in the room who are all treading the same path. And I don't think that there is kind of really anywhere else in our culture which is offering that very kind of safe container for particularly women's transition now. And we're a pioneering generation. There haven't been women like us who have kind of worked all the way through and who have kind of come into the world with a different sense of agency or equality or what things might be like.
Yeah.
And so there isn't a story or a map for us for what we do having hit this midlife point. And I think that the conversation about menopause is the beginning of the Queenager roar. It's the beginning of women like us beginning to kind of flex our muscles and say, look, we're here and we've got something, important to say, and that we need a new story about what we do from here on in. And I think that's true for men as well. But all the research shows that it's women who lead behaviour change at this point. And also because of the male lens and the framing of women in our culture, we end up kind of, pretty beached and pretty lost at this point. There's such a huge sense of lack I see in the women. They all feel it's them being kind of uniquely crap, whereas actually it's systemic.
I think, though, by opening up these conversations and including men, and as I said, we've got 2 boys, 2 sons, I think actually it's helping them to understand, because they're as clueless, really, as perhaps we were, because of the way the generation. So it's not a criticism of what our parents did. It's just saying, this is where we are. Now we've handed this. Now we can do something with it. So I'd love to know where the name Queenager came from.
So Queenagers. Well, for me, I see my daughter's finished university last year. She's just been in Paris for a year, working as an au pair, and she's come back and doing masters and that kind of thing. But so I can see her kind of on the cusp of that. That wonderful bit in your 20s where actually it doesn't feel that wonderful at the time. It feels a bit overwhelming about what on earth am I going to do. But I feel that there's a moment again in your kind of 50s when you're a queenager, when you get that same kind of sense of, wow, what next? There are all these things that I could do, or I kind of want that to be kind of how it feels. And so for me, there was something around, one of the ladies in our research said to me, I feel like a teenager, but in my 50s with nice sheets and good tea in my own house, which I thought was brilliant. And then I spend a lot of time in Jamaica where they talk about older women often as queens. So I think in my headline writing brain, the queens and the queenager and the teenager kind of came together. And it seemed to me a much more kind of positive rebranding. We are midlife queens. We're moving into our power. I want all the women coming up behind us to look forward to being 50 is when it gets good. We outspend millennials 250%. We're behind 86% of all luxury travel choices. We can have a good time at this point. I see lots of women going back to study, to university, or changing careers, or going off on that bucket list trip around the world that they've always wanted to do. We can see this as a moment of exploration and adventure when we finally get to become the women we always wanted to be. It doesn't have to be a tale of kind of scrap heap and, downhill. We've got this incredible gift of longevity, of this lifespan, health, and with it, the health span. Women between kind of 50 and 75 now are, if we're lucky, we're, pretty active. We've still got our marbles. We've got a lot of experience and wisdom. There's lots of things that we can do, but we're not that's not being amplified in the culture. That's not really being seen. It's beginning to come. I've been loving the new series of The White Lotus, which has kind of 3 queenagers kind of, going off on tour. And you're beginning to get some interesting female producers, I think, in Hollywood making some kind of interesting content around women at this point. Kind of Kate Winslet with the mayor of Eastling, and or the Nicole Kidman movie, or even the new Bridget Jones movie, which was very much about a queenager and about grief and about loss.
Yeah.
I don't think we'd have seen that 20 years ago.
No, I don't.
Or Nicole Kidman. I mean, whatever you think of, I really love the film Baby Girl, about exploring kind of fetish, because it was about her finally being empowered enough for what she wanted sexually. And I see that within the Indian community. One of the circles last week was going that they'd just been to a kind of fetish club and worn latex and kind of had a kind of new lover, or others were talking about this website Field, which I hadn't heard of, which is where you go if you just want kind of casual sex. Apparently most people on it are men. It's like 90% men, so if you go on there as a woman, you're definitely going to get some hits. So but why not? It doesn't have to be all tales of kind of slippers or kind of knitting circles. It's I think that there are women embracing all different aspects of themselves at this point. My friend Fiona Lambert's an incredible fitness influencer who can do like endless chin-ups at 61 and has a much younger boyfriend. I mean, there are lots of different ways of being a queenager. I mean, my real definition of it is being a queenager is whatever you want it to be.
I love that because and that's really finding who you are, and really identifying that. One of the things that I think I always found quite difficult to me, I don't know how you can define this, but people would say, "Oh, darling, don't worry, it'll just make you stronger." And sometimes you used to go, "I don't want to get any stronger. I'm strong enough," sometimes. And I think it's how It's how people talk to you. You've got amazing people around you. You've got a huge community. I was just looking at all your wonderful. Are they ambassadors or what?
Yeah, they're kind of, I call them my advisory board, but really what they are were kind of women who I knew or who I'd worked with or, you know, who I admired. And when I was setting up Noon, I kind of reached out to, you know, lots of people. And I, you know, because I was a journalist for so long, I have a pretty amazing contacts book. And I kind of reached out to a lot of them. And I was basically like, I'm going to set this thing up. Will you kind of will you kind of come on my advisory board? I don't really need you to do that much, but it's kind of lending me your name and your kind of imprimatur of kind of authority. And it was so sweet. Not a single person said no. And it was very hard sometimes it's hard to reach out for the support that we need. And I think that that's one of the other things that I love about Noon is that the women really help each other, and they kind of, you know, and we're learning to ask for the help that we need and to also to learn to receive it. And so for me, I was somebody who'd had a lot of patronage for a long time, but actually asking for help when I need it, I found it really hard. I think a lot of women do. And it was very sweet to have so many people kind of rally to the cause. And also I think that what we're doing is just so necessary. You know, I have a fantastic team at Noon, but we're really trying to turn the tide on a really kind of massive thing in the culture. So it's been pretty pleasing to me that the book has, I mean, every day I get emails or messages on social media from people who've read the book and say how much it's helped them, and that they were really in despair and they read the book and it kind of gave them hope. And that was really why I wrote it. It came from quite a dark place for me, and I wanted it to be there as a guide and a support for any other woman who found herself in that position so that they didn't feel so alone. Because I did have a network that I could call on to kind of help me reinvent, but I hope that Noon's there for, you know, for everybody now who needs a bit of supportive sisterhood and to find that kind of, you know, what that next chapter or that next phase, or just to have some support in asking the question.
It's a brilliant book. It's such an honest book. You know, you have literally put your heart out there, haven't you? And also, what's the kingfisher on the front? Is that?
Oh, well, I swim every day in the ladies' pond on Hampstead Heath. That's my kind of promise to myself. So I often think that the best tool for reinvention is to go back to what it is that we really loved, what reliably brought us joy when we were younger. And on lucky days, I see the kingfisher at the pond, and he streaks past with that kind of wonderful flash of kind of azure turquoise. And it always gives me a kind of hit of joy. So that's really why he's on the front of the book, because it was those kind of moments of those moments of joy which kind of help us through the difficult times. And I think that one of the ways that we manage transition is by making sure that every day we do something which reliably brings us joy, and then that helps us through the difficult bits. So for me, that's been waking up every morning and meditating for half an hour, which I do religiously. Anyone who knew me in the old days would find that hilarious, I think. And I swim every day in the pond, if I possibly can. And I try and arrange my schedule so that I can. So I think that a bit of prioritizing ourselves and our own well-being, or our own well springs of joy and energy, is incredibly important.
So obviously, you know, you're very fortunate because you did something that you absolutely loved, and you're now doing something that you love, and everything you're doing, I think, is phenomenal for so many people. But when it comes to people who perhaps their health is not very good, or you know, they're financially not very well set up, you know, to jump off that wheel, as we talked about, to try and find themselves is quite tough. What's your sort of take on that?
Yeah.
On that?
Well, I don't think it has to be expensive. You know, you can go and swim in the cold water somewhere for free. You know, if you live near a river or near the sea, you just go and do it. I mean, you have to pay a few quid to go to the Hampstead Ladies Pond, but I know it's about £100 a year for a season ticket. So that's that's about 30p a day. You know, that's not
Nothing.
I don't think that's excessive even on a budget. Or you can there's endless kind of podcasts and different things that would give you kind of inspiration. And all of us have something that we love. I was one of the Queenagers in the circle I was in yesterday was talking about how she loved playing tennis as a younger woman and she hadn't done it. And this weekend she'd got back on the tennis court and she felt so excited to be able to kind of whack the ball. So it doesn't have to be going to Jamaica to take magic mushrooms. It can be much more local. But or the other thing that reliably brings me joy is reading books and writing. So whatever it is for you that is the thing that makes you feel in flow. It could be painting. On the retreat I was at, some of the women were wonderfully artistic and they were kind of painting kind of beautiful scenes. I can't paint at all, but whatever it is that you love is that thing. And I don't think it has to be expensive. I think finding the time can be difficult if you're kind of caring for somebody, but I think that we can always, meditation, completely free. You sit and and you're just with your thoughts for half an hour. You don't even need an app. There are lots of things that we can do. You can do kind of yoga off a free thing on the internet. These things don't have to be expensive. It's about finding something that makes you feel better. And I think for all Queenagers, every day we should be doing something for ourselves just because it makes us feel happy.
And as you rightly say, so many of the really, really key things.
Go for a walk, it doesn't. I'll go for a walk. Look at the flowers. Kind of sit under the cherry blossom. All those things are free.
They're all free. They're all free to do, and often it's just those small things that make such a difference, isn't it? So,
I think so.
So, where do you see Noon going in the future? What's your vision for it?
$1 million question. So I have a kind of massive vision for it because I think it could be, all things Queenager. I would like it. So we offer kind of things under kind of 4 headings. We do joy, which is like bringing everybody together. We run a book club. We run these circles. We run retreats, events, trips. So that's kind of making and creating friendship, creating community. That for me, connection is absolutely at the heart of what we're trying to do. And so many of the women say that they come and they've met women just like them, kind of like-minded people. And we now run these circles all over the country. So do have a look, see if there's one near you, or if you'd like to set one up, come and send me an email, eleanor@noon.org.uk. And so that's the first bit. So we call that bucket joy. Then the next bit, we talk about support. So that's getting expert advice from somebody like Sandra Davis, who's the top divorce lawyer at Mishcon de Reya. She supports our women who are going through divorce. We have a divorce WhatsApp group where the women are all kind of going, crikey, I've got this thing with my solicitor. What do I say? I've got to, give these documents. The lawyers are being a nightmare. So all these women are supporting each other, and we do that around divorce, bereavement, redundancy is coming up. We do some stuff about, and then the next chunk is what next. So that's kind of personal branding or what you might do. Maybe we're just about to bring out a big report into Queenager entrepreneurs, as I call them, women in midlife setting up businesses, and how we might do that. And we do financial planning, and we've had a lot of stuff about Queenager finance, what I call Queenager financial spanks. It's kind of what's our underpinnings. If we're going to live the 100-year life, how are we going to pay for it? So that whole kind of what next chunk, or maybe that's going back to study, or so I think that's a huge conversation for people. Maybe finding your purpose, but I don't want people to feel like they've got kind of purpose anxiety. I hear that quite a lot from women, and that's why I don't say. I think it's really important that it shouldn't be too prescriptive. You haven't got to pivot into your purpose. You can do whatever you like at this point, and that's the point. It's about choice. And then the fourth pillar, which we're kind of working on, is around, kind of Queenager stuff by Queenagers, for Queenagers, kind of women who are setting up businesses, which is what this report's really into, which are doing things, say, protein powder for, older women, or financial advice for women. Only 15% of financial advisors are female. So we're really encouraging of women who are thinking about women's money in a different kind of way, telling different kinds of stories about what you can do with it. And also some products. We have some Queenager t-shirts, and I haven't got my Noon mug. I've got a kind of Noon mug, Noon mugs and kind of t-shirts and all that kind of stuff as well. So those are the things. But going forward, I'd really like to have an app. And also I called it Noon rather than Queenager because I do think that there's something important here for men. And one of the things that, you can't eat the elephant all at once, but I would really like to do something for, I think we have Queenagers and what I call noble men. and do something around kind of, the kind of men at this point, and how, and the other thing I'd like to do is some mentoring of kind of older women helping younger women, and particularly I think the older men giving some kind of different ways of being in the world to younger men out there, because I think that that's really necessary. If the kind of main loudest voices for younger men are ghastly people like Andrew Tate, we're all in trouble. And in a world led by Donald Trump, this idea of the noble man and the kind of good man and as the kind of protector, as using strength to not to attack or to oppress, but to support. And what that looks like is so important. I've always been the main breadwinner in my family. My husband's supported me massively, did a huge amount of raising the girls. When they were sick, he would take the day off because I was paying the mortgage. So there are so many men who have adapted to a much more, a different kind of role from the ones that they grew up in. And I don't think in our culture we hero them at all. And therefore we're not giving younger men enough of a sense of what they might be. If women want men to be different and to step up, then we have to also give credit where credit's due and tell the stories of the men who we think should be role models, but who aren't seen or talked about in the culture much. And so I think that's really important. And I think as women have shifted, men are having to shift too, but they're not being very good at telling stories about, or the right stories about what that can be, or what a good man in 2025 looks like. I mean, I know that. I've got a fantastic one in my house. I'm sure you've got a nice husband too, or whatever. We all know lots of good men, but and I think a lot of them are feeling very lost in the current narrative. And I know a lot of them absolutely loathe what they see going on in America, or Trump saying you can grab women by the pussy, or that's absolutely horrific to lots of men who are not like that at all. But I think that kind of quieter majority need to speak up and start articulating what it is to be a good man now. So that's something. I mean, Noon, I think, is quite gender neutral. It's just that kind of halfway point. What are we going to do with the next bit of our lives? But I think that's just as important for men. And I see a lot of men who are also pretty lost at this point. The ageism hits them too. But I think it's different for men because if you think of the narratives and the culture around older men, there's all the kind of silver foxes stuff. I mean, think of the White Lotus. There's all those kind of old men sitting around in Thailand with their younger Thai brides. It's different, and they do kind of have more of a role. George Clooney, they're seen as getting kind of better with age, maturing like fine wine, whereas women are much more seen in our culture as like peaches, one wrinkle and we're in the bin. So I do think there's a kind of whole degree of difference in the Queenager experience, but that's not to say that a lot of men aren't feeling jolly lost at this point too. I know that they are.
I love the fact that you're not just in one focus, and I think what you're doing was extraordinary. And yes, there's a long way to go still. I can see that definitely.
I've been writing as a columnist and stuff. I've been writing about all this stuff for so long. And the lack of equality for women, and the gender pension gap. Women retiring with 35% less in their pensions than men. So I'm kind of, I'd also really believe that we can't, there is no other, we're all in this together. You're right that, if there's a kind of push against men, everything has a reaction. Everything we do matters. And therefore, I think we can't kind of just say, oh, there's a kind of bin over there, we're going to put all the stuff we don't like. It's all here, the light and the darkness. And we have to find a way to kind of love it all and bring it all in and bring the men with us. And also begin to get them to really think about kind of what it is that they want, or how they might kind of, talk about that. Because when I was thinking about the concept of the noble man, I like it because it goes with Queenagers, but I was thinking you could do it as the gentleman. And then some younger men were saying to me, oh God, that sounds a bit naff, we don't want to kind of gentleman. So it's also kind of about, they have to find the right language. I'm really interested in the language that we use to talk about midlife. So Queenager, I much prefer to, oh God, someone was suggesting the menopause. I can't tell you how much I don't want to be part of the menopause. I would rather be a Queenager. So I think it's the same for the men, that they need to kind of work out a new language of talking about this stuff. Or the same thing like empty nest. I think that's a really horrible kind of pejorative term. There's a lovely American woman called Gretchen Rubin who's come up with something called the open door, which is much better about the, when children leave home, that they can come back, I love that. So it's also thinking of better ways, more modern, more interesting, more realistic ways to talk about some of the things which are going on for us now. It doesn't have to be an empty, like, you don't need to be a spinster. We talk about women being child free, and a lot of our women are child free by choice. 40% of them are child free by choice. So it's kind of, I think language. I mean, I'm a journalist and a writer, so I really think language matters. And one of the things that I do in my book, at the end of Much More to Come, is a whole glossary of new kinds of ways of thinking about this point in our life. So Queenagers, I talk about like putty, or what I love this phrase of fallowing. So, sometimes we need a kind of a bit of a fallow period where we can kind of refertilize ourselves. I like this idea of my friend Aviva Wittenberg-Cox talks about 4 quarter lives in the 100-year life. We need to think about it in 4 stages, 0 to 25, which is kind of when you kind of grow, 25 to 50 as the ages of achievement. For I think a lot of women, they're the ages of survival. 50 to 75, I think of as the years of becoming, when we become the people we always wanted to be. And 75 to 100, that idea of harvest. And I think that there's so much more interesting research and thinking to be done about that 75 to 100, which is such a new period of life. My mum's 81, she's still going skiing, she's a psychoanalyst, she still works. There's a whole different way of kind of being in the world as we age, which we're the kind of first humans to really kind of work out. Lifespans have doubled in the last 100 years. There's this whole extra bit of life that we haven't really thought properly enough about what we're going to do with it.
And you shifted those, because often it was like, the harvest bit was often, when you got to 60, where now that's shifted, that's going, as you said.
Well, it's more like 75, 80, and there's a lovely guy in America. I went and launched my book out in New York a couple of weeks ago, and there's a chap there called Michael Clinton who runs something called Raw Forward, Raw into the second half of life. And he's very much talking to kind of businesses about how they need to think about longevity, because all businesses are going to have to think about older people as consumers. There's a company called 55 Redefined, and they're looking at, they basically say, if you don't have an age strategy, you don't have a growth strategy, because older people are the ones with the money. And the demographics here are interesting. So I'm a bit of a nerd on this, that we used to have a kind of triangular shaped demographic, kind of, less older people at the top, more younger people at the bottom. Now it's a square, because there are so many more older people. And there are far less younger people kind of coming through. So as a proportion of society, we're going to have a lot more oldies and a lot less younger people. And so actually there's 50 to 75 people. It's going to be really important to keep them economically active.
And I think one other thing that we've talked about in the past is the fact that, that's where they're the people who are the decision makers on what they shop for, and what go, all their shopping, and they are the ones with the money. So actually, Are we marketing to them?
No, we're not being marketed to at all. I said between 6 and 10% of advertising feature older women, and often they're not the kind of women that we would see or relate to. I mean, there's some people who are doing it a bit better. Intrepid Travel have got a campaign which has got some older women kind of, climbing over mountains. The banks are trying a bit. HSBC has some kind of Queenagers going kind of cold water swimming, but it kind of falls into cliche quite quickly. And if you look at the kind of imagery that's around of older women, I was trying to find a picture of a Queenager on a jet ski. I couldn't find anything. We had to do it through AI. So that kind of thing really matters. And the intersectionality of this, I think, is really important. So, I mean, I talk about gendered ageism, which is where ageism meets sexism, but it's also much worse if you're disabled or you're BAME, or there are levels of this where it gets a lot worse. It becomes a lot harder. I'm a posh white, middle class woman who had the best education money could buy and has had a very successful career. So, I kind of think if it's hard for me, how hard is it for others? I'm very aware of my own privilege in this, but I also think that there are some kind of realities and some conversations and some steps that we can take, that what those stepping stones are, which are relevant to everybody.
I also think that sometimes when you haven't got anything, or you've got very little, sometimes you've got nothing to lose. I always think that when you're certain point, you can only go up, and actually you need to identify that. I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours. What I'd love you to leave our listeners with is 3 really important things that you see where Noon and your vision going forward, and why it's so important.
Well, I mean, what I really want to do is to change the narrative that we have as a culture about what women are for as they age. So that's like, number one. My big, it's not a small ask. It's kind of quite a massive thing to try and turn that around. But I do think that something that you can do as a kind of thought leader, or as a columnist, or as a writer, is to set new hairs running. And I'm amazed and humbled at the power of those words and the power of a new kind of way of thinking, and how it's energized and helped so many people. So I really want to do more of that. I want them to offer more, kind of practical help, and to expand the circles so they're kind of everywhere, a bit like the WI. So if you'll listen to this and you're interested, do come and find us at noon.org.uk. Do come and sign up, become a paying member. It's only a few pounds a month, and it really helps us do what we do. It's pretty difficult being a Queenager entrepreneur, and making the financing of these kind of things work is always tricky for all of us. So if you can help be part of the project, we'd really appreciate it. And spread the word, maybe buy the book, much more to come. Maybe buy it for the Queenagers in your life who you think might benefit from it. And most importantly, really start to think about your life in those 4 quarters, and that sense that you're not done at 50, you're just becoming the next version of yourself. And the other thing, I went to a literary festival in Ireland, and I spent a lot of time with the amazing Irish poet Paul Muldoon, and a wonderful Irish musician called Brendan Begley, who lives in a kind of van out on the Dingle Peninsula. And he said something which really, really stuck with me. He said, oh, I won't do the accent, but he said, Eleanor, the most important thing, both of them said this, is to learn to live well on little. And I really love that. It's like, so how can you, and so there's a bit of me that would just love to swim in the Dart and the river every day, and look at the cherry blossoms. So I think more of that.
So sometimes with these things that happen, adversity, something amazing comes out of it, and look what you've achieved, and look what you're giving to so many people out there. I'm excited to be part of Noon. I've just joined, just become a member, and I'm very excited. Maybe I'll start a circle. But thank you.
I would really love that. And I think the other thing is that no one's going to do this for us as women. If we're going to create this next act, this movement, this support, it starts with us. We all have to kind of step up and be part of that new story, part of that new journey, part of modelling for younger women that actually at 50 it all gets good. We're all part of changing that story. So I think that's the kind of biggest lesson. And thank you to you and your lovely podcast and your community for giving us a chance to talk about what we do at Noon in our work and everything.
I'm going to share that message hugely. But thank you so much for your time today, and we'll put in our show notes, you'll see where you can find Noon and everything else. But thank you so much, Eleanor. Thank you.